Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, senior editor at Forbes. Trump administration cuts to the U.S. Agency for International Development are putting Afghan female students studying abroad on U.S. scholarships at risk for being returned to the Taliban-controlled country. Last week, those students were told they would have the scholarships until June 30th, but their future after that is in question. Joining us now to discuss this issue is U.S. Congresswoman Chrissy Houlahan. She represents Pennsylvania's 6th District and is an Air Force veteran. Representative, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, as I said, there's been a temporary State Department extension on some of these cuts until June 30th, but there are students studying abroad on scholarships. What happens after June 30th to these Afghan women?
I think you and I are not necessarily are qualified to guess that, given sort of the erratic nature of this administration and the haphazard approach that they've taken to a lot of things. This included in terms of having, a hundred and some Afghan students who happen to be women, who are subject to the whims of this administration, and it's confounding, to be honest. And it's also, in this particular case, it's dangerous as well. So if those young women are sent back at whatever date they're sent back, it's not only at the detriment of their education and their advancement, but it's also in some cases physically dangerous to them to return to what amounts to an apartheid state for women.
You have a lot of policy goals. Where does this factor in for you, and what do your efforts on this issue look like?
So this kind of hits on almost everything that I work on here in Washington. I do work a lot on women and girls and STEM and STEAM education in particular. I'm a former educator myself. I taught high school chemistry. I also am an engineer myself, and so the value of a good and strong education, particularly for women and girls, is very, very important to me personally. In fact, just about an hour ago, we passed a piece of legislation on the House floor unanimously about mathematical and statistical modeling for K through 12 education. That was a big passion project of mine. I'm also a veteran. I come from a military family, and it is fully appreciated the importance of that region of the world, and the fact that we've had a 20 or so year war, including for some of that I was active duty during Desert Storm. And so I think the sort of fate of the Afghani people and the Afghan women is an important one to me personally, and also from a national security perspective. And then, of course, just the general, as I mentioned, kind of erratic decision-making process in the early days of this new administration is something that I spend a great deal of time on. I just got off the phone with one of the largest mushroom producers in the world. My district is the mushroom capital of the world, and we were having a conversation about tariffs and their effect on agriculture, on again, off again, on again, off again, in the same way these young women are experiencing it in the case of the mushroom industry, costing them hundreds of thousands of dollars every day with on again, off again, policies. And in this case, with women and their education, as I mentioned, the stakes are sometimes their lives.
We will have to have a separate conversation about mushroom tariffs, because the back and forth on that issue has been incredibly frustrating, to say the least, I think, to a number of business owners. But when you look at the cuts to USAID, I'm wondering, is there any merit to what the Trump administration is doing? Does it feel like there's a broader thesis that will benefit America here?
It's really hard to find a thesis that holds any sort of water here, any sort of hypothesis of why some of the best money that we can possibly spend, the most effective money that we can possibly spend, is on the front end of a crises. And instead of doing that, which has been tried and true throughout our history, we've had 80 or so years of peace through this kind of diplomacy and this sort of humanitarian aid, as well as, of course, a strong military to back it up as well. The idea that we would unravel USAID, in a matter of weeks and months, and that without any sort of real comprehensive look across the landscape and trying to figure out, what is worthy of cutting back on, what and what isn't. You're seeing it in kind of the opportunities that I think China is particular is seeing coming out of this, coming right into where we're leaving, and we're leaving a vacuum and they're coming in. So no, I can't really find any hypothesis that makes any sense other than a real understanding that the American people feel as though they would like to make sure that we're focused internally on us, and that we would like to be responsible to the taxpayer, make sure that there is no fraud, waste, and abuse in any area. And that I understand. I really do genuinely understand that it's my responsibility and the responsibility of our government to be here and make important and smart decisions on behalf of the American people for their domestic tranquility and their national security as well. And that's in fact what has happened. That's, I think, what the frustrating part for me as a lawmaker is these aren't haphazard decisions of where USAID, is or isn't. This isn't haphazard decisions over the VA or DOD or USDA or FDA or any of those other places. That's what we do here in Congress, and that's what the agencies do over time with their appropriated funding. And to come in and have what appears to be a singular group of unqualified humans come in and just, hack away at these and then redo and undo them is just it's honestly it's fraud, waste, and abuse. You're watching it happen.
I spoke to the CEO of a global organization that works with refugee resettlements earlier, and her comment was that it's a threat to national security, effectively, because our partners around the world look to see if America keeps its promises when working with people like in Afghanistan. As a veteran, as a congresswoman, what is your perspective on that statement?
Absolutely the same. I had a chance to be at the Munich Security Conference a few weeks ago when I was in the audience when Vice President Vance gave a excoriating speech about the EU and NATO. And you could have heard a pin drop, and the repercussions felt around the world for our NATO allies, for those who we are forming alliances with in the Indo-Pacific, for those who may or may not choose to join us in alliances in Africa or other nations. What I heard, was that America can't be counted on. And that is absolutely a threat to national security, because we have to be good to our word, good for our word. And you can bet that what people heard coming from Vice President Vance's speech in Munich was heard in Asia, was heard by President Xi, was heard by Taiwan and the Taiwanese, government. All of those kinds of things. The world is very, very small, and they have huge implications.
Now, a little bit earlier, you mentioned the VA, and you recently wrote on social media that our country owes a great debt to those who have served in our armed forces. Unfortunately, the Trump administration is turning its back on our veterans by stripping away essential resources from the VA. What are you seeing specifically in your district, and what needs to be done to counteract these measures?
So I don't think we've seen the final shoe drop on this. So there has been the beginning indications of, I think, what will be a pretty massive loss of jobs. And remember that many of the jobs who serve veterans are held by veterans. So it's estimated that about 1 in 4 people who hold a job with the VA are veterans themselves. Let's assume that those cuts that we're hearing that are coming, 80,000 or so people will come. They will come right out of the opportunities for good health and good lives that my veterans in Coatesville experience. I have a VA hospital right in Coatesville that is one of the nation's oldest, actually. And what we've already seen, even before this final shoe drops, is we've already seen some degradation in care. And let me give you some specifics. Some people have been asked, who are in the mental health space, to return to office. What does that mean? They return to offices that can't accommodate them, in spaces that are too small for all of them. These are mental health professionals, and they are now being told that they have to return to their office, to an office where they're sitting in banks of phones, where they're providing mental health counseling to veterans, sometimes by phone, sometimes as we're speaking, to one another. And the idea that a veteran will consider his or her case secure and private when there's a phone bank of people who are sitting on card tables in some cases, processing calls, is it's false. I can firsthand say that it's really important that people feel as though when they call in or they dial in that they have a private conversation with somebody. And so these consequences of return to work with no thought to where work is insane, especially in the mental health space.
What will it take to give those workers enough space or provide the resources that the VA needs, in your opinion?
Well, this gets back to kind of the beginning of our conversation with these young students from Afghanistan. Why are we making these kinds of choices in such a haphazard kind of a methodology? Um, why are we having a conversation after the fact about unwinding a decision that was made rather than making a deliberate decision and thinking, hard about it? And that's been the case with the VA as well. Only, it's really easy, I think, for Americans to kind of think, well, those are 100, women far away getting an education from a country that isn't the United States. We don't need to worry about that. But you can bet the minute that our veterans are being affected, there will be all kinds of people crying out for, change. And that's why I really just want to prevent that from happening to begin with. Why is this an okay process that we're going through? It's absolutely an untenable process. And as I mentioned, this is what our jobs are here in Congress. My job on the Armed Services Committee is to go through a very painful appropriations process and a painful approval process of what our budget will look like for the military every year and where the money's going to go for the military every year. There's the same conversation that happens for the VA every year. And so we have to be able to have our government work. And that doesn't mean that we have people coming kind of swooping in from the outside, telling us what we got wrong. And I think this is why I understand the American people and their American people's anxiety. People approach me and say things like, well, I just don't understand. This is okay. We're just putting a pause on it for 90 days. We're just taking a look at what's, happening and how we're spending things. And if that were true, I would understand that. But that's not indeed what's been happening. These are programs that in many cases have taken years. This is the third time that mathematical and statistical modeling bill that just passed today has passed in the House. And so hopefully this year it'll be the first time it passes in the Senate and it'll become a law. And so this is not, some sort of overnight process where we can just undo all of the work that we've done. And I think that's one of the things I'm most worried about, particularly with our vets.
There's the Silicon Valley move fast and break things thesis is being applied to the federal government right now that I think we're seeing the real-time ramifications. Turning slightly, though, it kind of does relate overall to national security, which has been a theme of this conversation. Earlier today, you reiterated a call to have all government employees better trained on classified material. Can you explain why you put that letter out in the open today?
Sure. And this is actually a specific call for our members of Congress to have security training. As a member of Congress, I get granted a top secret clearance just by being elected. There is no background check. There is no training process. And I come from a military background, and I actually come from a background where I held a TS/SCI clearance, as did my father, as did my mother, as did generations of my family. And that is something that I don't take for granted. Sometimes it takes as much as 2 years for somebody to go through the vetting process, and then even more time to go through the sort of training process of what it means to hold some of the nation's most secret information in your hands and how you need to manage it so that people don't die. And so what I've been trying to accomplish here in Congress is, okay, I give up on us going through background checks. I've tried to get that as a requirement. But at a minimum, when we come to Congress, we should have annual training that tells us how to manage classified information and also who we can share it with and how we can share it. That's at a minimum, bare minimum, what we should be doing. And as you've seen today with the news, coming out of the administration and coming out of some people who ought to know better, and their background is significant enough that they do know better, that they have broken some of those laws. They have broken the trust and faith of the American people, and they have given information that in people's hands is deadly to Americans. And in my opinion, they ought to resign.
Is there anyone specific that you would call to resign?
I'm still in the process of weeding through all of these exchanges. Literally, it's right in front of me to try to understand, who to aim my ire at. But I come from this family of service where if you do something like this and what you've done is wrong, you resign. And so I don't know that I'm at this point ready to name names because it looks as though there's more than a couple who ought to know better than that.
Final question. You've referenced the concerns of your constituents and the American people throughout this conversation. And I'm just wondering if you've had any town halls recently or anything else that you've been hearing from them that might, I know it's early, but that we might hear about in the midterms or just even over the course of this year. Anything that's popping to the top of your mind?
Yes, I've been in office now for 6 years, and we've held a town hall about every month, 3 to 4 weeks in between. We have held almost 100 town halls, and our most recent in-person one was attended by 700 people, and we also had to turn away what we estimated was 400 to 600 more people because there weren't enough seats in the theater that we held it in. What I'm hearing from people is what I think you've heard in this conversation. There is definitely a group of people who understandably want to make sure that our government is working for them. I do too. Want to make sure that people who are in this position are being good representatives and good leaders. I do too. And there are also a lot of people who are very, very concerned with what they're seeing happening right now, particularly with Musk. And his behavior, with the behavior of the Doge, and with kind of the disconnectedness that you're seeing between the administration and Doge and their efforts. We recently saw a piece of news that came out that said that Elon was going to be briefed on the war plans for China. Like, that makes no sense. Well, it turns out it made no sense for the administration either. But the fact that there was no communication, or seemed to be no communication, between Doge and the president is pretty darn alarming and ought to alarm people. The idea that we will somehow clean this up afterwards. When I was at Munich, I had the opportunity to talk to a lot of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle and ask them, how are you listening to your community who are worried about what's happening, and adjusting for the fact that people are losing their jobs, in the VA, or people are not getting services at the national parks. And they said, well, we just figure it'll all work itself out. That Musk will get tired of Trump, or that Trump will get tired of Musk, that those things that are wrong will get unwound, and, that Secretary Rubio will make it all better, in the end. And if that's the way we're going to run the government, that's some pretty crazy stuff. And so I think that that's what the people in the town halls that I'm holding are also telling me, is this is not how we run a government. And so I think it's really important that I do my best to, as we've been doing in this conversation, to learn and research and respond to the things as fast as they're happening to us all, and try to make sure that we still have a republic at the end of all of this.
Representative Chrissy Houlahan, thank you so much for sitting down with Forbes today. We so appreciate your time and your insight.
Thank you for having me.